The reemergence of Theseus from the labyrinth described the death and resurrection of Dionysus, rising up from the underworld in victory. The horn or crown that he possesses in the myth is the very crown that we have represented within the constellation Corona. We can easily see by this seventh labor that Hercules can be identified as representing the same persons as Gilgamesh, Mithra, and Orion. The eighth prophecy demanded that Hercules was to capture, dominate, and then release the constellation Libra, as drawn up originally by Ulugh Bey, Tartar prince and astronomer, 1450 AD. Libra is the only one of the 12 constellations within the zodiac that represents an inanimate object. All others represent either people or animals. The sign was always associated with the god or goddess of righteousness, law and order, and judgment or justice. She was called the Queen of Heaven, and often depicted in her triad form, and often called by the names Night, Order, and Justice. And within her hand she held the royal scepter. She was called the Goddess of Justice, and has also been identified by some to be equivalent to the heavenly virgin Themis, her very name signifying the perfect one. Themis is said to have lived upon the earth in the days before the flood. When she had been incarnate in her human form, she went by the name Asterea, said to be the daughter of Themis, but in spirit she is Themis herself. The sign speaks of a day when all of man's works must be judged, whether they are good or evil. Each soul will receive whatever is determined by the results of this judgment of their lives. This image is believed to be as old as civilization itself.
And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire.
Within this ancient papyrus, we see the jackal-headed Egyptian god, Anubis, who weighs the hearts or souls of every man upon the scales of judgment. Each soul must be compared against the perfect essence of the goddess Mayet, who herself represents both truth and justice. Mayet herself is often symbolized as a feather. She is the embodiment of truth and justice and is present at every soul's judgment. Amut is the Egyptian hound of hell who eagerly awaits the judgment and deciding of one's fate, waiting patiently to devour the heart of any soul who shall be judged guilty. In Egypt, Anubis, who can be seen within the constellation Canis Major, stood alongside the scales within the halls of judgment and carefully weighed the lives of those who were presented before him. Anubis was the jackal-headed son of Osiris and Nephthys, the sister of Set and his consort, but lover of Osiris. It is Anubis who has the responsibility of preparing and ushering the dead souls into the underworld. Anubis would declare forth the verdict, and that verdict would be carefully inscribed within the ledger books of heaven by the celestial librarian or the lady of the books. This Egyptian goddess was properly called Mayet, the goddess of truth and justice. The Egyptians taught that without truth and justice, or right and wrong, creation itself could not be sustained. It was further believed that truth and justice was the very light with which Ra had originally displaced darkness.
And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. and the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire.
In Persia it is not Anubis, but Mithra, who was to judge the hearts of men according to that which is written in the laws of the contract between man and his Creator. The contract was considered to be a covenant of life for all who obey the laws. The evil ones would be punished by the hammer or mace of Mithra. Zoroaster taught that Srosha, the last Messiah, would impartially judge the works of mankind in the balances of judgment. Within the Scandinavian myths, it was Odin who would judge every man. Those judged faithful would stand on the side of right and fight alongside Odin in the great final conflict of the ages. On the other hand, those who were judged as being unfaithful would find themselves standing on the other side, together with all the opponents of Odin, to fight against the great God and his heavenly kingdom.
And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven, and devoured them.
Although the constellation is usually pictured as a balance within the sacred books of India, the sign is called Tula and is represented as a man bending down upon one knee while holding a pair of scales in his hand, apparently begging for mercy from the Great One who sits in judgment. Within the Persian sphere, the figure is that of a man lifting the scales up in his one hand while grasping a lamb with the other. One interesting side note is that the standard that was used to calibrate the scales was primarily a lamb, which meant that everything that was to be weighed was to be done so in comparison to the usual weight of a lamb. So we might conclude that the feather of Maat simply represents the Lamb of God, for it is against Maat that all things are to be compared or measured. The ancient Jews represented the sign of Libra with the letter Tau. Tau was the last letter of their alphabet, and so signified the end, the boundary, the limit, and the completion. It is fitting then that Jesus Christ paid the price of redemption upon the Tau, as this symbol itself symbolized the wondrous mystical sign, which also represented the very scales of heaven, or the balance of heavenly justice, recalling those final words which Christ uttered upon that Tau, which was his cross. We are also reminded of the sign of Libra, which itself prophesied of this day of God's great sacrifice. Those words are reproduced here.
When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost.
When we look to the ancient Akkadian calendar, we discover that their 7th month was named Tulku. It is well known that the Akkadians named their months after the heavenly signs. Upon closer examination of this word, we discover that the word Tulku is derived from 2 words, the first of which is tul, which means a mound, while the second word is ku, which means sacred. We learn from this that the ancient Akkadians referred to this sign of Libra as being representative of the sacred mound or holy altar. The sign of Libra clearly declares that all men shall be judged according to the standard set by the Lamb. The debt will be paid upon the sacred mound, which we know to be Mount Calvary. This was prophesied in the days of Abraham, after he had prepared to offer up his only son as a burnt offering.
And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh. As it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh. As it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen.
In Hebrew, the constellation of Libra was anciently called Mosaneim, which simply means a pair of scales or a balance. We see the use of this word in the scripture, where Daniel is asked to interpret the strange words that had been written by the finger of God upon the wall during the great celebration feast hosted by King Belshazzar.
Tekel, thou art weighed in the Mosen and art found wanting. Mosen is a Chaldean word meaning balances or a pair of scales.
In Arabic, the constellation Libra was called Al-Zubayna, which means a purchase or redemption. In Coptic, it was called Lambadia, which means the house of propitiation. The word Lambadia comes from two roots, lam and badia, which mean graciousness and branch. Together they speak of the atoning grace of he who was called the branch.
And he is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world.
On one side of the balance, we have the brightest star, which is named Zubin al-Ganubi, being located in the lower scale, whose name means the price deficient. On the other side of this constellation, we have the star named Zubin al-Shamali, which means the price that covers. This star was also called by the name Al-Gubi, being located in the upper scale, which name means heaped up high. It speaks of a great weight that must be added to the scales to achieve a balancing of both sides.
None of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him. For the redemption of their soul is precious, and it ceaseth forever.
Yet another star on this side of the balance is named Zubin Akrabi, which is located under the lower scale. Its name means the price of conflict. Such conflict undoubtedly speaks of the price paid by the victim, which in the sign is the figure of Lupus, who is that sacrificial animal that is slain by the spear of the centaur. Overall, the sign Libra instructs us that the price of man's own redemption is extremely costly and cannot be purchased by anything that he himself might possess. In and of himself, there is absolutely no hope of pardon. A very ancient concept among the civilizations of the past was that of a kinsman redeemer, also referred to as the Goel within the Hebrew Scriptures. The Goel was generally the nearest living male blood relation, and upon him were placed certain duties or responsibilities. The primary meaning of the root vindicare is to make a claim. It is from this word vindicare that we get our English word vindicate. The responsibilities of the Goel could be expanded to anything that might vindicate a person's honor. According to the Oriental law of kinship, the Goel had three main responsibilities. Foremost, he was the representative chosen by the family to redeem the lost inheritance or paternal estate, which might have somehow been lost or sold through poverty.
If thy brother be waxen poor, and hath sold away some of his possession, and if any of his kin come to redeem it, then shall he redeem that which his brother sold.
This duty was considered as being fundamental to the basis of Hebrew law, which considered such things as real estate to be the inalienable property or ownership of the family or tribe. According to priestly legislation, it was the family who ultimately owned the land and not the current landowner himself. Second, the kinsman redeemer had the responsibility to redeem his brother, who might have somehow, through some unfortunate set of circumstances, fallen into slavery himself.
Plead my cause and deliver me. Quicken me according to thy word.
In many such cases, the chosen relative of the unfortunate one would merely act as an intermediary between the two parties. In such cases where the relative might wish to make some kind of restitution,
For their Redeemer is mighty. He shall plead their cause with thee.
in such cases, the Goel was to take the place of an advocate to enforce the claims of the oppressed, especially in the case of an orphan or one quite incapable of standing up for himself.
For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth.
We might also infer from the book of Ruth that one of the duties of the kinsman redeemer was to marry the widow of a deceased kinsman's widow, if he might freely choose to do so. However, the Levitical law limited such an obligation to the immediate relative or sibling.
And if a sojourner or stranger wax rich by thee, and thy brother that dwelleth by him wax poor, and sell himself unto the stranger or sojourner by thee, or to the stock of the stranger's family, after that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him.
Lastly, the kinsman redeemer, more precisely called the blood avenger, had the responsibility to balance the blood of his relative, which had been spilled by another person, whether such an act had been deliberate or accidental.
And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man.
We should not imagine that this particular custom was in any way limited to the Hebrew people, but rather understand that such practices were very common throughout the many different peoples or civilizations of the world, appearing to be even at the very roots of every ancient civilization throughout the world. The responsibility of the blood avenger might often be expanded to include any member of the clan, as they consider themselves to be strongly bound together by blood. Such a blood binding was considered to be one of the strongest unifying forces, causing the various members of a given family or bloodline to ultimately be perceived as one unit or tribe in reality. Among such civilizations, any major wrong inflicted upon an individual within that clan might equally be perceived as a crime against the entire clan. Any obligation to punish such wrongdoers might very well be perceived as resting ultimately upon every member of that clan individually, especially in cases involving the deliberate or premeditated act of murder. Balancing the bloodline was considered to be a very positive act by all members of the clan. Within some civilizations, the next of kin was considered to be bound, both by spiritual law and tribal custom, to avenge the blood of his brother, not only upon the murderer himself, but also upon the entire family or bloodline of the transgressor, for the guilt of the murder was to be equally shared by every member of his family or bloodline. It was evidently believed that early detection of such behavioral characteristics or disorders had ultimately rested upon the nuclear family unit. Such criminal tendencies might easily be addressed long before the child had grown into adulthood. By addressing such issues early in the life of that child, the family might easily prevent the affliction of the innocent in the future. According to the Old Testament, for instance, a disobedient, rebellious child was to be turned over to the governing rulers of the people. That child was then to publicly receive a severe warning by the governing authorities. If it had later been determined by such authorities that this child chose to continue committing such rebellious and criminal behaviors, he would eventually be stoned to death in the sight of all as a severe warning to all others within that civilization that such criminal behavior would absolutely not be tolerated by the fathers. This notion of a shared responsibility of blood guilt might clearly be seen within the most ancient Arab customs. However, the Mosaic law apparently limited responsibility of such crimes to the murderer himself.
The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin.
This state of unrest was to continue throughout all eternity and would only cease, implying that this soul had finally been laid to rest, after that the blood of that victim had been rightfully balanced and avenged. That member of the clan whose blood had been nearest to the victim hears the continual crying of that blood or soul loudest. It is important to realize the difference between the crime itself being viewed merely as an act of killing and thereby causing the extinction of a life, in contrast to the spilling and wasting of another person's blood, which was therefore a crime against that very bloodline. In the case of the Hebrews, if the cause of death was proven to be accidental, the blood avenger was not to seek vengeance upon the slayer, unless that person had deliberately left the city of refuge before the death of the high priest, who had been living during the days of the crime that he had committed. The closest notion we might find in our day would be that of a blood-related vigilante. We would expect to find such a custom prevalent in areas where the regular appointed authorities are perceived to be especially lacking and inefficient in their administering of justice to and on behalf of the common people of the land.
The revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. When he meeteth him, he shall slay him.
The Messiah, that divine Son of God, whose coming had been promised first to Eve to redeem the fallen sons of Adam, was to function as the kinsman redeemer and thereby satisfy all three of these requirements. It is not until we fully understand this responsibility that had been laid upon the shoulders of the Son of Man, speaking of course concerning Adam, long before the earth had even been brought into existence, that we are able to perfectly grasp or understand both the first and second comings of Jesus Christ. Let us more closely examine man's current dilemma. God had originally entrusted Adam and his sons with the earth and everything that it contained.
And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth."
Man was to stand upon this earth and to sit in the very seat of God as a God, to rule over all the inhabitants of the earth.
What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honour. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet.
That would include any strangers who had made a decision to set up their dwelling upon the earth. We are referring, of course, to those spiritual beings of which it was written that their original habitation was not of this earth, but located somewhere else within the heavens.
And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth."
What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honour. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet.
Adam and his sons had lost possession of this earth through the fall, and Satan had somehow, through this same fall of Adam, regained his original throne here upon this earth. It is clear from the account of the temptation of Christ within the Scriptures that Satan had somehow possessed authority over all kingdoms and nations upon this earth. It also appears that Satan had authority, right, and privilege to give this earth to whosoever he had chosen.
Again, the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and showeth him all the kingdoms of the world, and the glory of them, and saith unto him, All these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me.
It is further clear from Paul's writings that in spite of the earth being given to Adam initially, Satan had somehow become himself the god of this earth.
But if our gospel be hid, it is hid to them that are lost, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them.
Each of Adam's children had somehow been sold into slavery, the prince of hell becoming their cruel taskmaster, as all are now born into the bondage of sin and death. This bondage and enslavement of the soul of man is graphically represented in type by the historical enslavement of the children of Israel within the land of Egypt. It was only the hand of God himself that might be powerful enough to deliver them. Their only hope was in that precious promise that God himself would send forth his deliverer to bring out the children of Israel from their captivity, and finally to lead them into a land which floweth with milk and honey. The children of Adam were under the curse of sin.
And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return.
Their only hope was in the promised Savior, whom would one day come forth into the earth to set them free. He was, in fact, their kinsman redeemer.
For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now, and not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. For we are saved by hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for that we see not, then do we with patience wait for it.
Not only had Adam lost possession of his inheritance, which is to say the earth, but he had also lost each of his children, every one of which had been sold into slavery to the prince of darkness. Adam lost his own life, and he being dead had absolutely no hope and no possibility to rectify any of the circumstances that might have followed as a direct result of his fall. Clearly, Satan is himself called a murderer from the beginning. He comes but for three purposes.
The thief cometh not, but for to steal, and to kill, and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly.
The kinsman redeemer, being himself the champion of Adam's family, comes forth primarily to liberate the captives, to regain the lost possession, and to rebuild the kingdom of his father, Adam.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the broken-hearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord.
It was only the blood avenger himself who might satisfy the demands of justice while at the same time balance the account of Adam. For it is not so much a physical as it is a spiritual law, one of which we of the Western civilized world, notice I said Western civilized world, We, of the Western civilized world, are unfortunately much too ignorant of. The Bible clearly states that blood must absolutely be shed to balance the blood that has been shed. This is not a negotiable requirement, at least not in the world of the Spirit. The life is in the blood. For life, it seems, is the most precious of all things that exists. The law of the spirit world insisted that although Christ knew no sin, he himself had to become the personification of sin itself in the flesh. It was only by his being transformed into this detestable state that his own blood might also be shed to balance the blood of Adam that had been shed.
For he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him.
It is not absolutely necessary that we understand or even agree with this requirement, but only that we believe it.
And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life.
Through his death, he had managed to conquer the one who had the power of death. He triumphed over him, being tempted in all points as we ourselves are tempted, yet he himself did not fail, nor did he sin. In and through his willing obedience, which he performed to honor the sacred and holy law of the spirit world, Jesus proved himself mastery over all the power of the enemy. This is the Son of Man, born of the flesh of Adam, who has suddenly come forth to redeem his ancestors as well as his own children, and finally put to rest the longest clan feud within the history of man. According to the Scandinavian myth, Odin knew of the predestined fate of his precious son Balder. From the time of his birth, it had been decreed that this Balder was for some reason destined to die. Odin had been forewarned of this great calamity, having previously gained the power to look far into the future. The death of this practically invulnerable son of the great God of gods was revealed to Odin in a dream. Although Odin had the power to see and know the future, and although he sat upon the throne of heaven, which is to say the throne of Asgard, he is as it were himself, the King of kings and Lord of lords, and although all other gods bowed before his authority, even the great Odin himself was powerless to save his beloved son. Not even a god can alter the destiny of a man, for it is his destiny. The Viking followers of Odin clearly understood that although Odin's power was great, even a god with such mighty power as he himself had could not protect their lives forever.
And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many. And unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin, unto salvation.
Fate had already ordered that each man must one day perish. Eventually, Odin's great power of protection must fail, and fate, being stronger than he, would have its own way. The fall of each of the gods at Ragnarok, which refers to that great war at the end of the age, was considered by the Scandinavians as being directly related to the inability and or failure of Odin to prevent the death of his son Balder. Exactly how or why Odin is considered responsible is not really clear. It is not that Odin himself causes Ragnarok, or for that matter, the death of his son Balder. It is only in his weakness to prevent it from occurring that he himself is somehow to blame. If our country enters into a war and many Americans are killed, it is the president who is to be blamed. If because of that war, the world views all Americans with contempt, it is the president's fault. If the economy rises or falls, the name of that president shall be recorded with such a notation within annals of the history. Why? Merely because the president is the end of the line. As the famous quotation suggests, the buck stops here. Although Odin took every possible precaution, doing everything that he could think to do to prevent the death of his son, he was unable to cheat the hand of fate. Fate had claimed the life of his precious son, even though his mother Frigg had taken upon herself the responsibility of petitioning all plants, trees, rocks, metals, etc., to make a pledge that they would not allow themselves to be used as, or in any way formed into, an implement of destruction or an instrument of war to be used to slay her son. Phrygia, or Frigg, is here, of course, is the wife of Odin. She is said to have been very wise and the great protectress of warriors of whom Odin, for some reason, neglected. Freya or Frigg seems to be same or similar goddess as Aphrodite. All had been to no avail, though as one small plant, the infamous mistletoe, was somehow overlooked. So it is that Loki, the evil spirit, somehow discovering the secret of this mistletoe, formed a dart out of one of its branches, and he who was considered to be virtually invulnerable had finally died the very death that had been prophesied long before his own birth. The story reveals how that Adam was predestined to die, even though God himself did not force Adam to sin. We should clearly understand without any hesitation or confusion that Adam had freely chosen to sin. He could have just as easily chosen not to sin. Often we are tempted to believe that God has ordained this or that particular thing to happen in our lives. We must continue to remember that we are free to make certain choices within our own lives. For instance, we might as well address the big question that so few wish to talk about. Some teach that those who are saved are ordained to life, being somehow predestined to come to Christ. And we agree that this is true, but what of those that are damned to an eternal lake of fire? Are they predestined to hell? The answer is yes. They shall go where they have chosen to go, and that is what they shall do. It is not God saying one goes up and the other goes down. And although God knows before the foundation of the world that the one will choose death over life, there is nothing he can do to prevent that one from making his decision. Every soul will arrive where he is destined to go, in spite of all efforts to save him. Why? That soul does what that soul will do. In the Norse myth, Balder could only be raised up from the dead if every living person on earth was willing to weep for him and join Frigg and Odin in mourning for the death of their son, as one would weep for the death of his only son. Although all of creation agreed to lament the unfortunate death of Balder, Loki, being the adversary and master of deception, transforming himself into an old woman, refused to weep for Balder. By refusing to join the rest of the world in lamentation for Balder, Loki triumphed and Balder remained in the grave. The ancient prophecy decreed at his birth still gave some hope to Balder, however, for at the end of the age, following Ragnarok, the great war of heaven, the present order of things would pass away, and then Balder, the son of Odin, was to rise again. This ritual of weeping for Balder, who is the same deity as Tammuz and Bacchus, seems to be a common thread running throughout many of the ancient religions.
Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and, behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz.
When Balder rises from the dead, he does so as the overseer of the new creation. As the first Adam, although perfect in every way and completely invulnerable, he merely comes into this world predestined to die. As the second Adam, he represents the Creator himself, and he in effect becomes the reason that a new creation follows. As a result of the great war called Ragnarok, all is destroyed except for the two beings that had been somehow hidden within the world tree, Lif and Lifthrasir. In Norse mythology, Lif and Lifthrasir are two humans who hide in the world tree Yggdrasil during Ragnarok, the apocalyptic battle at the end of the world. They survive the battle and go on to repopulate the earth. The names Lif and Lifthrasir are Old Norse words that mean life and striving after life. The earth is at first completely covered with water, except for the top of the world tree. Finally, after some time passes, the new earth rises up from out of its watery grave. It is then that Balder rises from the dead. After this, a new sun appears within the heavens, even brighter and more glorious than the sun that was before. Afterwards, the eagle is again seen flying in the sky over the mountains. That particular eagle is the symbol of Odin, and it would appear that Balder, the son of Odin, now becomes the new Odin, or the god of gods. All the earth is restored to a glory surpassing that preceded it. The only two human beings, male and female, are given the command to repopulate the earth again, much the same as it had been done in the past.
And God blessed them, And God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth.
The myth of Balder leads to the story of another who is prophesied to come. It seems that Odin had received another prophecy following the death of his son Balder. The prophecy decreed that Balder's death must be avenged. His blood had to be accounted for, and that blood screamed out continuously to be balanced. It was declared that the avenger could not be one of the gods of Asgard, for it was the branch of the earth that was used to kill the son of Odin. For this reason, the earth is also held somewhat accountable. The solution to this great dilemma was then prophesied. The child must be half human, being sired of the seed of Odin, while at the same time being planted within the womb of a mortal virgin. The virgin was to conceive and gave birth to a child whom she would prophetically name Bo, meaning he comes. Bo would come into the earth predestined to accomplish this one main objective. He was to be the blood avenger of Balder. To balance the blood that had been spilled by Loki and the mistletoe, it is Bo who is represented in the constellation named Bootes. The very name Bootes in Greek finds its origin from the Hebrew root Bo, which simply means coming. Bootes is the coming one, or simply he who cometh. The star, located just below his waist on the right side, is named Mirak, which means coming forth as an arrow, who would not be reminded of the murder of Balder by the hand of Loki and the dart made of the branch of mistletoe. Bootes is represented as having a spear in his right hand for defense, while he wields a sharp sickle in his left hand, representing the harvesting of the fruit of the earth.
And I looked, and behold a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle, and reap. For the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe.
His stance is as one prepared for battle, as he positions himself directly in front of the serpent, whose name is Serpens. The precious sought-after crown stands between the two of them, as if the winner of the battle shall win the crown. He comes forth from Coma, the mother with child, and stands between the serpent and the flock of sheep or cattle behind him, which is identified with the constellation Ursa Major, as if to rescue them from their enemy.